A catchy start. Have you ever looked in the mirror and felt like a stranger was staring back at you? There was a time when you looked into the mirror and saw someone young, vibrant, full of dreams. But as the years passed, that image slowly faded, replaced by lines etched deep by time and sacrifice. You see silver strands where dark hair used to be, hands that once cradled children now marked with age, eyes that have witnessed both joy and heartbreak. And in that quiet moment, a thought lingers: who am I now? For many women, life is a series of roles: daughter, wife, mother, caregiver. We spend decades pouring our love into others, ensuring everyone around us is safe, nurtured, and supported. We celebrate their victories, comfort them in their struggles, and in doing so, we often forget someone crucial: ourselves. Society teaches us to be selfless, to prioritize the needs of our family, our work, our communities. And yet, it rarely teaches us how to love the one person we spend our entire lives with, ourselves. Evelyn was one of those women. At 68, she had spent her entire life making sure everyone else was happy. She was the dependable wife, the devoted mother, the woman who always put others first. When her marriage ended at 50, she told herself it didn't matter, her children still needed her. But then, one by one, they grew up, moved out, started families of their own. And one morning, she woke up in a quiet house, with no one left to care for but herself. The silence was deafening. The loneliness, overwhelming. She had spent so long defining her worth through the love she gave others that she had no idea how to love herself. One afternoon, as she walked through the park, she overheard a conversation between two young women sitting on a bench. One of them sighed and said, "I feel like I'm never enough." Evelyn stopped in her tracks. Those words, so casually spoken, struck her like a lightning bolt. Never enough. She had spent decades feeling that way: never beautiful enough, never accomplished enough, never worthy enough unless she was giving all of herself away. That evening, as she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, she didn't see just an aging woman staring back. She saw a stranger. A stranger who had spent a lifetime being everything to everyone but had forgotten to be something to herself. And in that moment, she realized something had to change. That night, as she lay in bed, she scrolled through her phone and came across a quote from the Buddha: "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." The words felt foreign yet strangely familiar, like a truth she had always known but never dared to embrace. Deserve love? Me? She wasn't sure where to begin, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder, what if I could learn to love myself? This is the story of Evelyn, a woman who spent her entire life searching for love, only to realize that the love she needed the most was her own. Part 1. Introducing Evelyn. Evelyn had always been the kind of woman others relied on. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who stayed up late sewing costumes for school plays, who made sure her husband had his coffee just the way he liked it every morning. She took pride in these things. They made her feel needed, valuable, important. For most of her life, she believed that love was something you proved through service, through sacrifice. And so she gave, without hesitation, without question, without ever stopping to ask if she had anything left for herself. But life has a way of shifting beneath your feet, of quietly unraveling the things you once thought were permanent. At 50, Evelyn's marriage ended. She had spent decades pouring herself into the role of a wife, only to find herself suddenly alone. At first, she told herself it didn't matter. Her children still needed her, and that was enough. But as the years passed, they, too, moved on. They built lives of their own, as they should. The phone calls became less frequent. Holidays grew quieter. And slowly, the house that had once been filled with laughter and movement turned into something she barely recognized: silent, still, empty. She told herself this was simply a new chapter, one she should embrace with grace. But deep down, an unsettling thought took root: if no one needs me anymore, then who am I? Evelyn had spent so long defining herself through the roles she played for others that she had never stopped to consider who she was beyond them. She had been a wife. She had been a mother. But now, without those identities to anchor her, she felt unmoored, adrift in a sea of quiet days and long, restless nights. She tried to fill the emptiness with routine, morning walks, reading, tending to a small garden in her backyard. But no matter how much she tried to stay busy, the loneliness crept in like a tide, washing over her in waves of regret and self-doubt. She would sit by the window in the late afternoon, watching the world outside continue without her, and wonder if she had already lived the best years of her life. One evening, she came across an old photograph tucked away in a dusty drawer. It was of her, taken decades ago, long before she became a wife or a mother. She was laughing, her eyes bright with possibility, her posture free of the weight she carried now. She stared at that young woman for a long time, searching for something familiar, something that still remained. But all she could think was, where did she go? She placed the photograph on her nightstand, unable to put it away just yet. And as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized something with startling clarity. She had spent a lifetime loving others, but she had never learned how to love herself. The thought unsettled her. But more than that, it stirred something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet whisper of hope. Part 2, A Moment of Awakening. It was a late autumn afternoon when Evelyn's world shifted, though at first, it seemed like just another ordinary day. The leaves had begun to turn, crisp reds and golds scattering across the sidewalks as she took her usual walk through the park. It was something she had started doing after retirement, a way to fill the quiet hours and convince herself that she still belonged somewhere in the rhythm of the world. She walked the same path every day, past the pond where children fed the ducks, past the wooden benches where couples sat in quiet companionship. But on this particular afternoon, something made her stop. Two young women sat on a bench nearby, their voices drifting toward her in the cool air. One of them sighed heavily and said, "I feel like I'm never enough." Evelyn froze. The words hung in the space between them, simple yet weighted, as if they carried the weight of something she had been trying to ignore. She glanced over at the girl who had spoken, probably in her 20s, her face young but already shadowed with self-doubt. Evelyn felt an ache in her chest, not just for this girl, but for herself. Hadn't she, too, spent a lifetime feeling that way? Never enough as a wife, never enough as a mother, never enough on her own. She walked away quickly, but the words followed her, pressing against the quiet corners of her mind. When she arrived home, she set down her coat and made her way to the bathroom, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. She flicked on the light and looked at herself in the mirror. Not just a passing glance, but really looked. She saw the fine lines that traced her forehead, the deep creases around her mouth, the silver that streaked through her once dark hair. She saw the way her shoulders slumped slightly, as if carrying invisible burdens even now. But beyond all of that, she saw something deeper, an emptiness in her own eyes, a quiet sadness that she had never allowed herself to fully acknowledge. For years, she had given everything to others, believing that love was something earned through sacrifice. She had poured herself into roles that no longer existed, and now, standing in front of her reflection, she realized that she didn't know who she was without them. Her gaze dropped to the bathroom counter, where her phone rested beside the sink. Almost without thinking, she picked it up and scrolled absently, trying to distract herself. But then, a quote appeared on the screen, shared by an old friend from college. It read, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." Buddha, her breath caught. She read the words again, then again, as if trying to absorb their meaning. Love and affection, for herself. The idea felt foreign, almost indulgent. But then another thought followed, quiet but insistent. What if I tried? For the first time in years, a flicker of something stirred within her, not certainty, not immediate understanding, but the smallest, most fragile glimmer of possibility. Part 3. Embarking on a new journey. The next morning, Evelyn woke up with an unfamiliar feeling, a quiet, persistent pull in her chest. The words from the night before still lingered in her mind. You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. She didn't quite understand what that meant for her yet, but for the first time in years, she felt a need to do something different. To break the cycle of loneliness and self-neglect that had kept her trapped in the past. Later that afternoon, she found herself standing outside a small Buddhist meditation center, its wooden sign swaying gently in the autumn breeze. She had passed by it many times before on her walks, always wondering what it was like inside, but never feeling like it was meant for someone like her. Today, however, was different. Today, she stepped through the doors. The room was simple, soft cushions arranged neatly on the floor, the scent of sandalwood lingering in the air. A few people were already seated in silence, their eyes closed, their breathing steady. At the front of the room stood a Buddhist monk, his presence calm and grounding. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, her old doubts creeping in. I don't belong here. I'm too old to start something new. But before she could turn away, the monk caught her gaze and offered a small, knowing smile. It was an unspoken welcome, one that told her she was exactly where she needed to be. She took a seat on one of the cushions, feeling out of place but determined. The monk began to speak, his voice gentle and measured. He talked about mindfulness, about learning to sit with oneself without judgment. He spoke of the power of presence, of simply allowing thoughts and emotions to rise and fall like waves without clinging to them. As Evelyn closed her eyes and tried to focus on her breath, she was startled by how loud her own thoughts became. Why am I here? What am I hoping to find? Doubt whispered in her mind, but she stayed. She listened. She breathed. And in that stillness, something began to shift. At the end of the session, the monk posed a simple question to the group. If you could speak to yourself the way you speak to a dear friend, what would you say? Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent years offering kindness to others, words of encouragement to her children, reassurances to friends, comfort to those in pain. But when had she last spoken to herself with that same gentleness? She left the center that day with no grand revelations, no sudden transformations. But as she walked home, there was something new within her. A quiet promise. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she had taken the first step. And for now, that was enough. Part 4. When everything falls apart, Evelyn had begun to feel something she hadn't felt in years, hope. The meditation classes had given her a sense of peace, a glimpse of what it might mean to truly be kind to herself. Each morning, she practiced breathing deeply, repeating quiet affirmations she was still learning to believe. I am enough. I deserve love. The words felt unfamiliar on her tongue, but she spoke them anyway, hoping that, one day, they would feel true. But life has a way of testing us when we start to heal. One evening, as Evelyn sat in her living room, sipping tea and reading, a message popped up on her phone. It was from an old friend. Did you hear? Richard got remarried last weekend. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She read the words again and again, as if somehow they would change. Richard, her ex-husband, the man she had spent decades building a life with, had moved on. Not just in the abstract sense, but completely, officially. He had found someone new. And while she had convinced herself that she no longer loved him, that she had made peace with the past, a sharp, unexpected pain cut through her like a blade. She set the phone down and stared at the walls of her quiet home. The house that had once been filled with shared memories, the place where she had loved, fought, forgiven, and tried to hold things together long after they had already fallen apart. She thought about all the nights she had spent alone after their divorce, convincing herself that she was fine. That she didn't need anyone. That love was something she had outgrown. But now, as she imagined Richard standing at the altar with another woman, smiling the way he once smiled at her, she felt the weight of it all crashing down. The voices in her mind returned, sharp and cruel. Of course he moved on. Of course he found someone new. And you? You're just an old woman sitting alone in an empty house. You were never enough for him, and you never will be enough for anyone. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The progress she had made, the fragile self-acceptance she had begun to cultivate, suddenly seemed meaningless. She felt like a fool for ever thinking she could change. Forever believing that self-love could fill the spaces left by others. She wanted to disappear, to curl into herself and let the loneliness swallow her whole. But then, from somewhere deep within, another voice, one she had only just begun to recognize, whispered back. Breathe. She closed her eyes, placed a hand on her chest, and inhaled shakily. Breathe, Evelyn. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not run from them. She did not push the pain away. Instead, she sat with it. Just as she had learned it in meditation. Just as the monk had taught her, this time, she did not abandon herself. Part 5, Learning to Love Yourself. Evelyn woke up the next morning with swollen eyes and a heavy heart. The pain from the night before still clung to her, lingering like the final notes of a sad song. But something was different. She had not run from her sorrow. She had not drowned it in distraction or buried it beneath forced smiles. She had felt it, fully, deeply, completely. And yet, she was still here. She moved through the morning slowly, making herself a cup of tea, watching the steam rise and curl into the air. The world outside her window was the same. The trees still swayed gently in the autumn breeze, the sun still cast its golden light across her small kitchen table. Life had not stopped. And neither had she. As she sat down, she reached for her notebook, the one she had bought months ago but never dared to use. She flipped it open, hesitated, then wrote the first words that came to her mind. I am still here. The sentence looked small on the page, but it felt enormous in her heart. For so long, she had defined herself by who she was to others, Richard's wife, her children's mother, a friend, a caretaker. But beneath all of those identities, there had always been her, waiting patiently to be acknowledged, she thought. Back to the monk's words from her meditation class, if you could speak to yourself as you would to a dear friend, what would you say? Evelyn had spent her entire life offering kindness, reassurance, and encouragement to others. But never to herself. She closed her eyes and imagined the younger version of herself, the girl in the photograph she had found, the one with bright eyes and an open heart. What would she say to her? You are enough. The words arrived like a whisper, hesitant but steady. You have always been enough. A deep breath. A release. That afternoon, she returned to the meditation center. This time, she sat with more ease, allowing herself to be fully present. When the monk guided them through a metta meditation, a practice of loving kindness, Evelyn followed along. May I be happy. The words felt strange at first, as if they belonged to someone else. May I be healthy. A small warmth began to unfurl in her chest. May I be free from suffering. She placed a hand over her heart. May I be at peace. And for the first time, she truly meant it, Evelyn walked home with a quiet sense of understanding. Loving herself wasn't about forgetting the past or ignoring the pain. It wasn't about erasing the loneliness with forced positivity. It was about staying with herself through the sorrow, the doubts, the moments of aching grief. Staying, even when it was difficult, and in that commitment, she realized, love had been there all along. Part 6, Overcoming Social Pressure. Evelyn had spent her entire life trying to fit into the mold that society had given her. As a young woman, she was taught that her worth lay in how well she could care for others, how gracefully she could hold a family together, how effortlessly she could balance sacrifice and duty. When she was married, she believed that being a good wife meant prioritizing her husband's needs before her own. When she became a mother, she poured everything she had into her children, ensuring their happiness, their success, their security, but what no one told her was what would happen when those roles faded. Society celebrated her as a caregiver, a nurturer, someone who gave endlessly without asking for anything in return. But now, at 68, with no one left to take care of, she found herself standing on unfamiliar ground. The world had told her what she should be for others, but it had never told her how to be herself. She had absorbed the silent expectations placed upon women her entire life, that beauty meant youth, that success meant being needed, that a woman's purpose was defined by her relationships. And now, as she walked through the grocery store and caught glimpses of herself in the glass doors of the freezer aisle, she wondered why the lines on her face made her feel invisible. Why, when she sat alone at a restaurant, she felt the weight of pity in the glances of strangers. Why the world had made her believe that to be alone was to be incomplete, but the more she practiced mindfulness, the more she understood what Buddhism had been teaching her all along. She was not bound by the opinions of others, nor by the unrealistic standards that had been imposed upon her. She was not defined by the number of people who needed her, nor by the fleeting nature of youth. She was enough, simply because she existed. One afternoon, during a meditation session, the monk spoke about non-attachment, the practice of letting go of the need for external validation. He explained that suffering often comes from our grasping, our desperate attempts to hold onto things that were never meant to last. Beauty, relationships, societal approval, these were all impermanent, like sand slipping through fingers. The more we cling, the more we suffer. The more we let go, the freer we become. Evelyn thought about this as she sat in front of her mirror. That night, she studied her reflection, but this time, instead of critiquing what she saw, she simply observed. She was not a fading version of her younger self. She was not a woman who had been left behind by time. She was here, now, in this moment, whole and complete. She whispered softly to herself, "I am enough." The words felt lighter than they had before. They no longer carried doubt. They no longer needed permission. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn believed them. Part 7, Building Community and Inspiration. Evelyn had spent much of her life believing that strength meant handling things on her own. She had been the rock for others, her husband, her children, her friends, always offering comfort but never asking for it in return. Even after discovering the power of self-love, a part of her still hesitated to reach out, to share her journey. But healing, she realized, was not meant to be done in isolation. One afternoon, after a meditation session, she lingered in the small courtyard outside the Buddhist center. A woman around her age, soft-spoken with gentle eyes, sat down beside her. They had exchanged polite smiles before, but today, the woman hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say," she began, "that I admire how you've been showing up for yourself." Evelyn blinked in surprise. "Oh," she said, caught off guard. "Thank you. I'm trying." The woman nodded. "Me too." There was a pause, then she admitted, "It's been hard. I lost my husband last year. I still wake up sometimes expecting him to be there." Evelyn felt an ache in her chest. She understood. She knew. And in that moment, she saw herself in this woman, not as someone separate, but as someone walking the same path, carrying the same invisible weight. "I know what you mean," she said softly. That conversation changed something in Evelyn. For the first time, she saw that healing was not just about loving herself, it was about connecting with others who were learning to do the same. Over the weeks that followed, she began opening up more in the meditation group, sharing her struggles, her doubts, her small victories. To her surprise, others did the same. There were women who had spent years feeling unworthy, women who had sacrificed so much of themselves that they had forgotten who they were. And as they spoke, as they listened to each other, something remarkable happened. The loneliness that had once felt so overwhelming began to fade, replaced by something new, a sense of belonging. Inspired by this, Evelyn started a small journaling group for the women at the center. They would gather once a week, sharing reflections on self-love, resilience, and the lessons they were learning. At first, some were hesitant, unsure of what to say. But with time, the pages filled with stories of heartbreak and healing, of moments of doubt and glimmers of hope. One evening, as they sat in a circle, a younger woman in her 40s looked at Evelyn and said, "I hope that when I'm your age, I can love myself the way you do." Evelyn felt tears welling in her eyes, but this time, they were not from sadness. They were from recognition, from gratitude, from the realization that her journey had not just changed her, it had created space for others to grow as well. She had spent a lifetime giving love to others. And now, by loving herself, she was giving something even greater. She was giving permission. Part 8, Lessons Learned. Evelyn sat by the window, watching the late afternoon light spill across the wooden floor. The house, once filled with echoes of laughter, now held a different kind of silence, not the emptiness she once feared, but a peaceful stillness. She had spent so many years believing that love had to be earned, that her worth was tied to what she could offer others. But now, she understood a truth so simple, yet so profound. It was never about being enough for anyone else. It was about recognizing that she had always been enough for herself. For years, she had carried the weight of expectations, the silent pressures of a world that told her she needed to be selfless, needed to give until there was nothing left. She had measured her value by her ability to nurture, to sacrifice, to hold others together. But in doing so, she had abandoned herself. The realization had been painful, like seeing her reflection for the first time after years of looking away. But through mindfulness, through kindness, through allowing herself to simply be, she had reclaimed what had been there all along, her own love. She thought of the night she had received the news about Richard's remarriage, how easily she could have let that moment break her. In the past, she would have spiraled into self-doubt, convinced herself that she had failed. But instead, she had sat with the pain. She had breathed through it, with it, until it softened into something she could carry without letting it consume her. She thought of the women she had met, each of them walking their own paths toward self-acceptance. How their stories had intertwined, how their struggles had mirrored her own. She had once believed that loneliness was her burden to bear, but now she saw that connection, real, honest connection, was the antidote. By opening herself to others, she had discovered a love that was not dependent on anyone else's approval. It was a love rooted in shared experiences, in understanding, in the quiet acknowledgement that none of them had to do this alone. Evelyn had learned that self-love was not a grand, dramatic transformation. It was not about erasing the past or pretending the wounds were never there. It was about showing up for herself, day after day, even when it was hard. It was about choosing kindness over criticism, acceptance over judgment. It was about looking in the mirror and seeing herself not as a woman who had been left behind, but as a woman who had finally come home to herself. She placed a hand over her heart, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her fingertips. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. She had spent a lifetime giving love away, and now, for the first time, she was letting it return to her. She whispered the words once more, not as a question, not as a hope, but as a truth she now knew deep in her bones: I am enough. Ending with a powerful message, Evelyn stood in front of the mirror, just as she had so many times before. But today, something was different. She no longer looked away. She no longer searched for the girl she once was or the woman she thought she should be. Instead, she met her own gaze with quiet recognition, with acceptance, with love. She traced the lines on her face, not with regret, but with reverence. These lines were proof of a life fully lived, of laughter shared, of tears shed, of strength found in the moments she thought she would break. The silver in her hair was not a sign of fading beauty, but of wisdom earned through every experience that had shaped her. For the first time in decades, she did not see a stranger in the reflection. She saw herself. And that was enough. She thought back to the question that had haunted her for so long: who am I, if I am no longer needed by others? The answer had come to her slowly, unfolding in quiet moments of stillness, in whispered mantras of self-compassion, in the gentle realization that her worth had never been dependent on what she could give. It had always been within her, waiting to be acknowledged. Evelyn smiled, a small, knowing smile, the kind that comes from surviving, from learning, from finally understanding something that had once seemed so elusive. She had spent years believing that love was something external, something to be found in the approval of others, in the roles she played, in the sacrifices she made. But now, she knew the truth. Love had never been missing. She had simply forgotten to turn it inward. She stepped away from the mirror and walked outside, letting the crisp autumn air fill her lungs. The world felt different, yet unchanged. The trees still swayed, the sun still warmed her skin, life continued moving forward. And so did she. At the meditation center that evening, as she sat among the women who had become her community, she noticed a new face, a younger woman, hesitant, uncertain, sitting alone in the back of the room. Evelyn recognized that look. It was the look of someone searching, someone standing on the edge of transformation but unsure of where to begin. She caught the woman's eye and smiled, offering her the same quiet reassurance that had once been given to her. A simple act, but one that held the power of understanding. As the session began, Evelyn closed her eyes, resting her hands gently in her lap. The monk's voice filled the room, guiding them through their practice. She breathed in deeply, feeling the rise and fall of her own existence, steady and unwavering. She had spent a lifetime searching for love. And in the end, she had found it, not in another person, not in the past, not in the expectations the world had placed upon her, but in the one place she had never thought to look, within herself. And if Evelyn could learn to love herself at 68, so can you.